Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ray Siegfried, and I am a professor at Arcadia University, where I teach health policy and healthcare administration. I'd like to welcome everybody here today to this great opportunity. Today's theme for our meeting is a renewal in supply chain value. And certainly in this crazy change that we all live in today, renewal is something I think we certainly need. So let me briefly introduce our panel today. We have 4 members, very interesting group. To my far left is Debbie Templeton. And Debbie is Chief of System Service at Geisinger System, responsible for the operation of health systems support. And it also has a system clinical enterprise, including the hospital and multi-specialist group practice, and many other items and departments and services throughout that great system. She holds a master's degree in health administration from the University of Scranton and also serves as a board member for Bellwether, Inc. Next to her is Ed Hiscock, and he is a supply chain practitioner who has served over 25 years in the supply chain area as well as the IT discipline. He holds a master's degree in supply chain from Michigan State University, is vice president of strategic sourcing and transformational officer for non-labor spending at Trinity Health, a leading Catholic healthcare ministry. And next to Ed is Nate Mickish. I'm sorry, I got it wrong. Sorry, is Karen Kirschnick, who is Director of Supply Chain and Clinical Consulting in Nebraska Methodist Hospital System. She holds a master's degree in nursing, and this year, 2017, will be a future famer. And finally, next to her is Nate Mickish, who was Vice President of Sourcing Supply Chain in Texas Health Resources, received his MBA from the University of Nebraska, is on the board of the Bellwether League, and received his Future Famer Award in 2013. So let's give them a hand and welcome a very good panel. Okay, so as I said, today the theme of this meeting is a renewal of supply chain value. And certainly in our time of change, one clearly understands why we need that. So for those of you who don't, let me just give you some reasons. So think about these items and what we're thinking about in terms of change. So reference pricing, bundle payments, capitation, global budgeting, prospective payment, value-based purchasing, ACA, no ACA, really? The need for meaningful use, patient-centered care, cost, quality, access, the need for both restorative health and maintaining population health, and my goodness, the list goes on from there. Crazy change, whitewater staff, you better believe it. But I think there may be something more than just simple change, as we've always had change in the healthcare market. So I think what we're having is both velocity and complexity of change, and that really creates and that adds up to turbulence. And that, I think, is where we are. So the questions that we have today is really, how are we going to change? How are we going to renew? How are we going to really elevate the supply chain value? So my first question to the panel is about this turbulence that currently exists in our market. And in this turbulent world, should we, as provider supply chain leaders, reach out to all others in our supply chain and work collaboratively together to design the solutions that we need for our healthcare demands? So have you seen this working, and where does it work best? So anyone from the panel?
Okay, I'll get it started. Sorry if this is a little loud. So yes, I mean the short answer is absolutely. We need to be collaborating with our supplier partners, and partner is a word that's been abused, of course, over the years. But we have actually engaged some of our largest suppliers in lean events, and we start the event off. And I guess to put this in context, it is supply chain from Trinity Health, where I'm at. Not my contracting folks, not my sourcing folks. And supply chain or S&OP folks from the supplier community, right, from their organization. And we sit down around a lean event and look at opportunities where we can lean out our trade relationship. We're not talking about the margin, which is typically
Right.
the horse trading we've been doing for years, right? We're just horse trading margin for market share. But this is a conversation between supply chain professionals about ways to take waste out of the system. So we've been running several of those events. It's amazing the results that can come out of that. Now, the challenge exists because then those supply chain people that we've gotten really tight with in the supplier side have gone home and tried to convince their commercial side of the business to change the way that they do things. So it's creating some tension in there, but we are actually helping them to develop rationale that's bubbling up to their senior leadership to try and look at ways to take waste out.
So in my experience, I worked for 8 years with Cardinal Health, and 5 of those were on site at Nebraska Medicine in Omaha, Nebraska, where they actually have had since 2001, I believe, an outsourced supply chain model there. The work that's done between both of those groups is truly, they're looking for every possible place that we can lean out steps or processes between our distribution center and our on-site folks there. And even though I don't work there anymore, I think like I do sometimes. But down to how the distribution center would pick, how things would be placed throughout the distribution center, how we would receive them, et cetera. I know lots of you are doing that with your own distributors, but just having the ability to work at the C-suite level as well with Cardinal and look for opportunities in both organizations really helped Cardinal truly be one of the only partners that that institution had. So that was one place where we saw a strong relationship.
I don't have a whole lot more added other than just to say that where I've seen these types of partnerships work best is when both sides of the table are really open and honest about what their goals actually are, and then build the contract around alignment with those goals. The other thing I'd say is that, I mean, all that happens with trust, and trust takes time. And so I will say that, we at THR are looking at doing longer term agreements with some of our suppliers and our manufacturers, because sometimes it takes 3 years to just get into a rhythm and have people that you can work with, that you trust, that can get things done on both sides of the organization. And if you're on a 3-year contract cycle, that doesn't give you much time to really build that type of momentum. So.
I'll just add maybe one twist and broaden the definition of the supply chain. And I think that we often don't include our clinical partners, those that we're trying to serve downstream, and the more that we can involve them and educate them on why we need to do what we need to do, I think that makes for more effective discussions and then support when you do go and make big change.
Okay, great. So one of the things we're also trying to do is to open up a question from the audience. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to have a clarifying question if you have one to the panel. If not, we can move on. Okay? Oh, yes. Wait a minute. Let me get the mic here.
Hi, my name's Don Schweer, and part of the support service group helping to outsource support services for acute care hospitals. With the advent of HCAPS and also the meaningful use value-based purchasing that has reimbursement implications, are you budgeting for those reimbursement implication changes or penalties? And are you thinking about putting those into your value equation when you work with vendors?
Yes. So, yeah, we are. And as you know, Don, some of the work that we've done at Trinity is to actually, it's our belief that that we need to better control some of those activities, and to Deb's point, working with the clinicians to make sure, and not only the clinicians, but also the food and EVS operations, to make sure that we are either partnering with a third party or bringing those services in-house to get better control of the mechanics and the mechanisms that will help us control those costs and realize what we may have budgeted from a revenue perspective.
I'm just going to add that we spend a lot of time looking at the data and then ensuring, A, that the data is correct related to what we're spending in those categories, but then really educating our providers and trying to partner with them to help them understand what their decisions are doing to those downstream outcomes.
I'd just say I'm typically pretty. Food's a little different because there's some direct HCAP questions around food, and what we've kind of found is that if it's hot and fast, it's a satisfier. But there's a lot of other, and I'm sure everybody here on this panel has heard this before, but there's a lot of other value adds the suppliers try to present to us that would help with HCAPs and length of stay and all those types of things, all these peripheral things that are really important but really hard to tease out causality. And so, I do typically approach those types of proposals with a fair amount of suspicion, unless there's, a hefty amount of risk share checks involved. So,
I think we'll get the logistics right after maybe the third question.
Yeah, I'll let you start.
I guess the other thing that I'll add is just trying to figure out how we can push more of the information upstream to patients in order to keep them out of the hospital to begin with. So you don't get hospital-acquired infections if you don't have to come to the hospital. So trying to push that education upstream, I think, certainly is important. And we're also doing a methodology this year that we called shadow budgeting, that we're working with our clinical institutes to sort of do a parallel budget to demonstrate how our finances would look if they got paid under a capitated, a truly changed system, not fee-for-service, in order to drive focus on the kinds of metrics like reduced length of stay, decreased infections that they need to focus on.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, because certainly with prospective payment and everything, it's a real issue. So especially for the budget. Great. Okay, well, let's move on to the next question. So this one continues the trend of collaboration and has to do with the sales and service strategy from our partners in the market, particularly those of suppliers and GPOs. So question to the panel, do we think that the strategies and methods are really quality decision-making in terms of supporting a lot of the issues that you all have as a provider?
So we'll do it right this time. I don't think that we have truly aligned incentives today in all the intermediaries of what it takes to push things through the healthcare supply chain. I think that that's part of our issue. Regarding sales and service, our organization isn't a big fan of the repless model. We think that everybody there could provide some value as long as the incentives are aligned and people focus on agreed upon targets that hopefully will cross and be similar, because I think more and more the issues on the supplier side are kind of blurring with the issues on the provider side. I don't think that they're that dissimilar anymore.
Yeah, I'd echo that, and I think too that to your earlier point, Deb, about trying to keep patients from ever having to come to the hospital, we're very acute care focused. But our organization is run by a fellow by the name of Dr. Rick Gilfillan. He came to us from CMS, where he ran the Innovation Center before coming to us. So we're actually, yeah, and Geisinger, exactly. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. Rick has taken us to that non-acute space in a big way. And as a faith-based organization, we're spending time washing homeless people's feet as much as we are working on what goes on within the four walls of the acute care setting. So, true story, actually, which I won't embellish here, but not before they come to the hospital, just to keep them from coming to the hospital. But it's really, my point here is that, is that to the sales and infrastructure that we use today to sell to the primarily acute care market serve us? they serve a portion of us. But thinking differently about how care is delivered, where it's delivered, how it's delivered, I think is necessarily going to have to change those models.
I think both of your points are correct, and I'm always looking with suppliers for true alignment, and I have yet to find that in my role today when it comes to understanding outcomes or their products proving some of the outcomes that we're looking for, and so and plus being able to measure that. So we're working hard on getting to that point.
There was a really good session at I think the spring SMI. A guy from advisory board had graded the ACA implementation. And one of the things I thought was really telling was one of the dynamics of ACA that wasn't graded well was the moving from fee-for-service to true fee-for-value. And I think that in terms of sales and service strategies that we're still seeing from the supplier community, it looks a lot like the old fee-for-service sales and strategies. And I think that it's going to continue to look that way until providers start getting paid a lot differently. So to that end, I don't know that we've all really quite adjusted just yet to trying to provide higher quality of care and moving into more population health type of capped reimbursement strategies.
Any clarifying question from the audience? Okay. All right, let's move on to the next one. And this one has to do with a new entry into the healthcare market, Amazon. So is Amazon entry into the healthcare, is this the right thing? And what are we going to learn from this, do you think?
Well, I think it's definitely the million-dollar question. They're starting to kind of ease their way into the healthcare market. I've got a couple thoughts on this. The first one is that Amazon's model is to help you part with your money really, really fast on a personal side of things. And so that scares me a little bit as a supply chain professional. The other thing I don't see yet that they really provide a unique distribution model or experience to the provider. I mean, we've had e-com for a long time with all the standard distributors. We've had hot shot or next day ordering or whatever you might call the Prime Now type of level of service. So I don't see there's a real differentiated experience from a distribution perspective. However, I'm really excited at the prospect of what they could do for population health with things like Alexa, with their prowess in managing data. So I would love to see them, something to the effect of, you have discharge orders for a patient, and you've got Alexa triggering the patient to, get up and walk around. It's time for you to go to your appointment. Are you taking your meds? Things like that. I'd be pretty excited to see what Amazon could do in that space as opposed to the traditional distribution space.
I don't know much about Amazon yet.
Yeah, so I first off, just in general, competition is hardly ever a bad thing from my perspective. It keeps us all sharper, right? So that aside, I agree with Nate. I think there's a lot of opportunity in the non-acute side of the business, very obvious, and also to the points you made about the data. And I know we're recording this, and I also serve on Chris's advisory board at Amazon, so I'm probably not at liberty to go much further.
No, I think any disruption is a good thing. And to your point, it does keep you on your toes. But I think that there are going to be some challenges in healthcare that I'll be interested to see how they tackle, including maintaining a chain of custody for products, because that's huge in our world, especially in the pharma world. They've been servicing doctors' offices for a while now. And in some of those platforms, change of products every other week doesn't really matter. When you get to more acute care settings where that standardization does drive more of a quality and maybe helps prevent some errors, that might be just a little bit different buying. But if they can help us unravel the tangled web that's been woven, that's called healthcare supply chain, I'd be all in to see what we can learn.
Great. Any clarifying question from the audience? Yes, can we get a mic?
It's pretty simple. Are any of you buying from Amazon today?
Oops.
We are.
What type of stuff are you buying from them?
Right now, it's random things that you can't normally get on a routine contract, but there are some things that we are doing through Amazon.
Yeah, and we are as well. The first thing we did was just go look at anybody that was using a trinityhealth.org email address and a P card to order from Amazon currently, and brought all of that under one umbrella, under one business account with Amazon Business. And it was, for us, it was over $3 million worth of MRO. And actually, you know, it's really interesting. One of the things when you get visibility, it's a supply chain person, right? You get visibility of the data, starts to teach you some things. And we had somebody when we were trying to convert them to the business account, well, can I still get the movies? and that was our reaction too. It's like, well, what do you need the movies for? I run a long-term care facility and we use them for the patients. So, you know, just things you hadn't thought about before, right? But that's a delivery mechanism to get you know, the sitting room movies launched for the patients.
We do have spend from or with Amazon. It's primarily going through the nursing department where they're ordering on their own personal accounts and using check requests to pay them back. I'm embarrassed to say we have a significant amount of check requests still in my organization that we're working on eliminating. So that's how Amazon's being used today and in my place.
Yeah, I'd echo that. We're not using them intentionally.
Yeah.
Yes, can we get a microphone? Sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to give a counter to Amazon because I think everybody leaps to, you know, the large innovator and so on. But the real disruptor I think that's coming in healthcare is actually going to come from Walmart. Walmart has bricks and mortars where they can still treat patients, they can do physicals, things like that, and they've linked that to their stores. And if you look at the footprint of Walmart, their footprint covering the population in many of the small and rural areas is substantial, far more than the large bricks and mortar acute care institutions which are in high geographic areas. So I think there's always this concern that in supply chain we immediately look at that big innovator, Amazon, when we're not thinking about the second and third players that have bricks and mortars, because patient care, whether it's inpatient, outpatient, home care, whatever, it's always going to still be hands-on. It is a service industry.
That's an interesting point, and I've just kind of heard from peripherally that's one of the reasons why Amazon bought Whole Foods. Although that wouldn't help with the rural, the rural setting, but let's see what we can get out of Ed on that one.
No, I completely agree. I mean, it's another form of disruption, and it serves potentially the same, but there's overlapping populations that could be served. But absolutely, and I haven't read the article yet. It's actually in my on my desktop is one of those things I saw come across on one of the feeds, how Walmart is going to take Amazon's entry into healthcare to task.
Plus, I'm not really quite sure how much percentage of healthcare is going to be delivered in a brick and mortar traditional place. With some of the Alexa things that you described and some of the new generations up and coming, I think a lot of things are going to be delivered right from the home. So that disrupts the supply chain and how to get the products there that they're going to need, whether it's prescriptions or whether it's supplies.
Okay. Oh.
So just excuse me, just a curiosity question. So in the acute care setting, standardization and aggregation of volume is obviously pretty highly prized, right, for some of the reasons that Deb alluded to and the fact that some of you are certainly big enough to do your own purchasing or through a national GPO. Have you seen Amazon yet start to disintermediate some of your standardization or volume aggregation efforts to a point where it's becoming problematic?
We have not. Like I said, the first activity was to gather what is going through Amazon today, and we didn't see any issues because of the populations they were tending to serve in our organization were not in the acute care space. They were a lot of the MRO and kind of things out at the clinics. It's a very handy tool for folks at the clinic where we are, arguably, you're correct, John, less likely to be concerned about the standardization out there. And more concerned about the standardization to reduce variation in clinical care within the acute care setting.
Yeah, no for us too.
We do have a integrated supply chain across the continuum of care at Texas Health, including our physician offices and our ASCs and imaging centers. And I will say that we haven't seen any disruption to date, but that is a fear of ours because, again, it's like you're opening up the formulary again, and we've already done so much work pulling all these different sites of care into our contracts and our standards. So it's a fear.
Can I ask the question a different way?
Sure.
We all know, I'm going to ask the question a different way. We all know what the history and the development of GPOs is. Isn't Amazon nothing more than a aggregator, a GPO in a much larger form? And are we not just moving from, we've watched the consolidation of GPOs from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and are we not just moving into a different type of aggregation model where the fees are still coming from the back end, which is provided by the manufacturer?
I guess to date, I'll let everybody else respond, but to date, I really still see Amazon as more of a distribution model as opposed to the GPO or having that type of service. Now, obviously, they've got enough information where they could start doing that sort of thing, but I do think it'll be a long road to get some of the more established manufacturers that have established relationships with the national GPOs to move over to Amazon. I think it's potential. I just don't know what the pathway is to that. So.
Yeah, I mean, in the short answer, it's yes. I mean, you're right, the path is long and sordid in our industry. We've got some very entrenched processes and infrastructure, but yeah, I don't see any difference. They look like a distributor today, but they aggregate and create a mechanism and a portal with one twist, right? And that is that they let the market decide what the price is. So the real, fundamentally to me, it would really depend on trying to strike that balance between selecting a product to deliver and drive out variation in clinical care and getting the best price. We've got a model that serves us in that fashion today, but then we've got all of this cloaking that goes on with all of the pricing, and of course everybody gives you the absolute best price and guarantees and all that sort of jazz. But and we all have the best price on everything, right? So I swear to it. But they're just bringing transparency to that. But I think the balance will be bringing transparency to that and not allowing, as John asked the question, people just completely going off the reservation and you got bad standards of care happening because you got people using different products. My fear is that the nurse comes to the shelf and today it's blue and you use it in your left hand. You come to the shelf tomorrow and it's green and you use it with your right hand. That's dangerous. And we have to control that. Anything else? This is gonna be the last question, Ray.
I did want to ask, I think it was just kind of getting at what you sort of alluded to. Is there anything that you're doing to control the quality of the product that's being bought on Amazon? In other words, there's a lot of resellers out there who are non-authorized resellers of product. You don't necessarily know where the product came from, if it's legitimate product and so forth. Is there any controls that you're looking at putting in place to deal with that?
We haven't had any clinical purchases going through there yet. It's been mostly, like iPad covers, office supply type items. And that's why I'll say the clinical folks are forced through our ERP system for ordering. So there's not much that's going outside.
And I think the reason I handed you the microphone is to your point earlier. They've got a big thing to solve in pedigreeing product. We have to have that. We have to have that assurance. And gray markets exist today and cause us enough grief as it is, let alone you just open that door up to much less controls, arguably.
Sorry. That just reminded me of one thought, too. I don't know if anybody saw the latest 60 Minutes on distributors being challenged about the amount of opioids that have been pushed through the system. And I think validating both ends of the buy-sell relationship there is going to be important.
Do you have a comment about blockchain solving that problem for us or anything? You guys are supposed to fix this for us.
Okay, moving us along with the topic of disruption. So unfortunately, this past year, we have seen tremendous natural disaster. And certainly that, unfortunately, has had a negative effect on supply chain. So my question to the panel is, what should we as supply chain leaders do to mitigate this disruption?
Well, I think one thing that we have been doing is learning from each other. So if we are fortunate enough not to be involved in a disaster, you can always learn from those that have been. And I think that the theme through some of the stories is even if you have the best laid plans, when the natural disaster takes away your hospital, you're left with a different kind of plan, right? So I think that unfortunately, I think that the supply chain in healthcare rallies the best when they're under crisis, and everybody seems to be able to pull it together and come together. But I think that it's going to be an ongoing challenge that we're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's some things we can do with transparency and some tooling around that to better respond. But by and large, we're already very good with manual systems. Michael and I had this conversation earlier. You know, down in Louisiana, he's frequently a target for some of those natural disasters, and took a pass this year, but deployed to other areas, to Houston and to Florida, those resources. To include, I mean, how many of us in our healthcare supply chain actually have a fleet of boats? So you can deploy those boats and rescue people off of streets that are now rivers, right? I mean, that's the degree to which we've manually prepared. And I think what we could probably do is just better tool those that are prepared in those ways for those disasters to have more transparency across the supply chain, to know where resources are, and we can more rapidly deploy them.
We don't have any boats, no boats,
Nebraska.
no boats in Nebraska for that. At least where I'm from, we, in our city, we have our biocontainment unit that's been there for about 15 years. That isn't a part of my current health system, but a part of Nebraska Medicine, where they've been planning for things like Ebola, which they had 2 patients over the last several years that were nationally recognized. And, to the point of learning from each other, I know Emory and Nebraska shared a lot of policies and procedures of how they prepare for those. But from a supply chain perspective, there were plans in place since 2002 on how to fill that unit with supplies and have things ready for them, so that we could, within I think the time frame was 45 minutes, be able to care for a patient in that room from the time of notification, right? Because in the case of Ebola, we had several hours to prepare for that patient to get there. That's a lot different than some of the things others are dealing with. But having those types of policies and procedures in place to support that is something we've done for years there.
Yeah, this is one of the areas that really keeps me up at night from time to time, just because we don't typically have a lot of natural disasters in Dallas, but we have had some things come up over the last couple of years that we didn't expect. And so I definitely agree with, you want to tap the collective wisdom of your peers across the nation. They may have gone through this before. I will say that there's also a tension point, because in the event of if you have a highly contagious disease that you're trying to manage, and the CDC is kind of changing their standards on willy-nilly, you have to be kind of careful. I hate to say this, you have to be kind of careful what you share with your peers, because you don't want everybody to panic buy everything and then you're scrambling even though you actually need the product. So there's a tension point there, but I think that it's really the folks that have typically fair weather that need to be more careful, because you're not expecting it, and so some routine drilling, doing some what if type of scenarios. What would happen? How would we respond if X, Y, and Z happened is pretty important.
Yes.
Just a question for the group. Yep. Oh, there we go. A question for the group, and it is actually, unfortunately, it's a tough question to, I think, try to answer, just based on current conditions. But in any natural disaster, the continuity of care is really our centering point. And do you see predictive analytics really coming into play at a greater level in the future to be able to allow the supply chain to be much more effective based on having some business intelligence in front of us?
leave it to the guy from Stanford. Yeah, so to ask, I mean, have you ever met anybody that could fit more syllables into a sentence? Love you, Nick. So I think the short answer is yes. I think we're still quite a ways away. And I say that just because we still are suffering from some very base data problems. Just, we're trying to solve that oftentimes with, well, if the data is big enough, it need not be as high a quality. So I think we're still suffering from some clarity in that regard, but I do think predictive analytics, there's a lot we can, and it was my experience with one of my companies a while ago that we could actually predict, on the human capital side, we could predict how many patients you were going to see in 2 North next Thursday within like a 95% accuracy to help balance staffing, right? So that's good predictive analytics. We're much more predictable than we think we are in healthcare. But it's interesting that you'd ask the question with a disaster preparedness bent. So were you thinking more about disaster preparedness to predict the likelihood of disaster or prepare for the disaster in the event of?
I think down the road we'll go in both paths, but if you take a look at, post an event, if we have predictive analytics looking at the type of care that's traditionally been delivered for those type of events, then we have a heads up on what we should be looking at from a supply chain perspective, and we can use that information to be able to be a better feeder system both in and out of the organization. So whether it's acute care or non-acute care, we understand the cohort of patients that are going to be required to deliver that type of care and the type of treatment that's going to be needed, and then the associated supplies that would be connected with that.
Yeah, at first I thought you were headed to the weather predictive analytics. But I think along that line, though, is getting comfortable with making a decision and going quickly, right? Because I think that the time delays that it takes for people to make a decision of whether you're going to close a clinic, whether you're going to move patients out, time is of the essence, right? And I guess you could always fault it for being too overly cautious, but I'd rather do that than wait till it's too late and then have a couple of disasters on your hands.
Okay. One more. And then.
Kind of related, but looking at it from the other side, one of the other side effects of natural disasters of any kind of making is product shortages that are a result of manufacturers being unable to provide. And historically, I think we've had this challenge related to transparency where manufacturers have not wanted to be very forthcoming about manufacturing problems, whether it's caused by a disaster or not, because healthcare providers hoard. And I just wondered, whether in your disaster planning or through some of your partnering, if any of you have identified ways to improve the transparency on the likelihood of product shortages or to deal with them like we're trying to deal with now with IV fluids and a host of other things.
In kind of a small way, we have an agreement with our primary distributor to keep some pandemic supply on hand that's really specific to our organization. So that helps with a little bit of a buffer. But there's always going to be those things like IV solutions that have reared its ugly head again, that are going to be a little bit more difficult. And then in a way, though, it still kind of comes back to relationships again, because typically your supplier is going to take better care of the customer that's working well with them and committed to them, and I've definitely seen that on the IV side. So.
Yeah, I would just say in my working with Nebraska Medicine and with Cardinal, that was something that I struggled with as an RN, understanding what product needs there were for the nurses, especially as a trauma center, if we were to have patients come in, but also trying to understand the regulations for quarantining product, if there's some sort of a recall, et cetera. I mean, I realize that's not a natural disaster causing a product shortage, but it's the same kind of a situation where we can't get product. And I think a lot of that also is related to education about how our distributors or our wholesalers are getting some of their products and how we can impact that on the provider side. So, I mean, there was a lot of education that I would have to do, even though I was working officially for Cardinal and getting a paycheck for them, to help the folks inside the four walls of the health system understand how they could get product or what we could do to sustain the product that we had. So.
Yeah, and I think no magic pill, Nancy, but I will say that we're learning. And from a Trinity Health perspective, we launched a self-distribution strategy some time ago. And one of the elements of that is global sourcing. And we've spent a lot of time actually visiting plants where the product is made here. We haven't gone abroad yet, but I do have somebody on my team that built her career doing that for one of the manufacturers, flying over to wherever the product is made, and I brought her onto the team with that in mind. As we get more sophisticated, we just need to get better at better understanding how product is made. You know, because it's not always the plant that gets taken out in Puerto Rico. It's oftentimes the resin is not available from somewhere else in the world, right? So really truly understanding more about the supply chain, we're trying to get more educated on that. And an element of that is, of course, for disaster preparedness.
So just to kind of blend 2 points together, so the collaboration question earlier and then your question around manufacturers, being more willing to provide visibility to supply. Is there a willingness amongst providers to consider more VMI type relationships where you share your demand, right, and then the manufacturers manage the ordering and inventory levels of your product, whereas they could identify where they may be having some supply issues and bump your safety stock up to an appropriate level that isn't considered necessarily hoarding. So I don't know if there's consideration, especially for those providers that are managing self-distribution warehouses, to consider VMI type relationships.
I think I was kind of called out there, wasn't I? No, just teasing. So, yes. So we have, like I say, we're just getting better. But the key, I think, in your statement and your question was the demand signal. That's my accountability, and it's typically pretty ugly today, right? So the way we express our demand is the cause of a lot of the inefficiency today in the supply channel. So we've got to get much better at that, and we're collaborating with some of our suppliers to do that through these lean events I spoke about earlier. But I mean, it's shocking when you get into the detail and you realize just how we're transacting today and the degree to which we're actually creating a lot of the issues that we complain about in the waste.
I was just going to say, the other thing is to make sure that there's good communication all the way through the supply chain. Because I think predictive analytics sort of go out the window when you do have some type of disaster or disruption. And if somebody on the one end is holding me to a quota and you're trying to explain to them that this isn't going to work for me, sometimes it's very difficult to get to the right person in order to break that logjam.
I was just going to joke that you're assuming a higher level of sophistication than most non-acute or most healthcare supply chains are at right now, and which has kind of been reiterated. But it's an interesting thought. I would think that there would be a willingness on my organization's part once we're ready to do something like that to go that route. Done.
Okay, great conversation, segueing into the next question, and that question has to do with supply chain technology that currently is on the marketplace. So to the panel, do you believe that the current technology, software, IT that currently exists really provides you with the valued metrics that you need? If not, what is missing?
I'll let you start.
Yeah, so no, I think no. What we're missing is a tool that truly integrates our financial piece and our supply chain information, as well as what's going on from a utilization perspective inside of our institutions, in the OR, on the floors, et cetera, and then also provides us at the same time what's happening to the patients while they're in the hospital, as well as down the road once they've left and as our providers follow them. So I'm always looking for how to grasp and gather the information from a clinical perspective of how that patient's doing 90 days, right? 60, 90 days out, just like we're expected to with bundled payments and things like that. But we have to use sometimes 30 different tools to log into. I mean, my list of passwords and login information for all the different tools from all the different vendors is growing on a weekly basis sometimes. And so trying to achieve a truly clinically integrated supply chain, which is what I believe in and work hard to have on a daily basis and have for years, is something that is, I think, almost hindered because of technology.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, how many icons can we possibly have on our desktop, right, or our phones? And one thing I'd add to that too is that I just did a little test. I had a supplier send me hey, your docs are talking to me about my little app here, and it does these wonderful things post-acute. How do I get in to talk to you? So I sent that over to our IT department and said, with all the malware stuff going on, what do we do with something like this? And so there is a tremendous amount of challenge going to be had trying to add more apps into our organizations these days, because the scrutiny is just ramping up every day. I mean, we are adding literally weeks onto our sourcing process just to get through that IT security assessment, plural, right? I mean, it's used to be one, then there was a security and PHI one, and then there was another security malware one. Another, I swear there's probably 6 assessments our IT department has to do now to try and keep our systems locked down. But so I think the answer you gave is spot on. There's far too many icons today. Unfortunately, a lot of those represent some really cool applets, right? So they give us a piece of the problem. And with the challenge and the convergence of all of the needs to make more secure environments to protect our patients, IT environments, I think we're probably going to stall out on a lot of those cool little apps. And it's going to be just wait until the big guys catch up, because we know their platforms and we're already secure with them. So it's going to be a challenging time, I think. But the day of all of these apps just popping up, I think, are numbered.
I was going to say, from the supply chain perspective, I wondered if this was kind of a trick question, because I don't necessarily know it's the supply chain technology that's going to be the driver, but it'll be the feeder for a lot of these systems that will connect us 360 to the patient to get to the long-term outcomes that you want. And I'll put my plug in here for the unique device identifier. If supply chain could do one thing that would enable this whole process, it would be to start building the links between unique device identification on all supplies and all implantables used in patients, so that we can have that 360 picture eventually.
I just kind of want to put one sort of fine point on the enormity of the complexity of the problem. So we're going to be implementing PeopleSoft at our organization over the next 3 years, and we're going through all of the interfaces that we have to build to feed into PeopleSoft. Right now, there's 170 that have to be built to feed into the ERP, and that's before you take into account all the nice new apps that Ed's talking about. So I mean, that's a lot of touch points into a system, and so I think we're going to be a long way away from getting there, but I'm hopeful that we will.
Great. So I think we have one more question I want to bring up, which I think is a very interesting one, and that is simply this. What is the right thing to do with succession planning, particularly with our future famers?
So I think we need mentoring. I think we need to hear from you guys. It's great, at least for me, to be around folks like you and listen. Several of the companies, when I worked with Cardinal, they had a WIN program, and I was in a mentorship program, and that I learned a lot about distribution through that group. And I think that, especially with millennials coming into our workforce, they learn a little bit differently than even I do, and being able to truly understand how they learn and how that differs from how I teach, or vice versa, how I learn and how it differs from maybe how you teach, and being able to truly be a little flexible in how we work together, I think, is important.
Yeah, I think a couple things too are, it's exposure. So within the organization, exposure to other disciplines, exposure to finance, to operations, to physicians and things like that. And then I've got kind of maybe a unique, maybe a crazy idea, but engineer a really low risk way for your future supply chain leader to fail, because they will learn a lot from that, and they will also learn that you got to be pretty gritty to be in this industry and to be in this role. And so give them a challenge that they may not quite be up to yet, that isn't going to impact operations and things like that, but something that would really teach them a good lesson, because failure, I think, in supply chain is an inevitability, and so you kind of have to learn how to deal with those types of things and how to come up with a solution pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's excellent. So really, I just view it as, I think Deb and I kind of got singled out as the old guys on the panel. But And I resemble that, and you don't, Deb. But I mean, that's one of my primary accountabilities, is to build my bench and to find ways. I love the idea about, low-risk areas of, I probably just ignore that a little bit too much, and we just let them fail in risky things. But no, I think it's incumbent on us as leaders to make sure that we're creating those opportunities. And we have actually I had this conversation with Mark earlier today where he was sharing a story at some little school in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he's helping out with some of the master's program folks there. And I was sharing that we have put together a cohort at Trinity, and we've come up with a case competition. And we're actually sponsoring a case. It was organized by Apex. And we're going to actually have teams of 4 or 5 students from several universities around the state coming in to listen to our case, and then we will judge their results. And then there's some pretty decent scholarship money. And I'm sure it'll be a Spartan that will take it. But Mark's not in here, is he? No, I wanted him to be in here. But anyways, so, but my point there is that, find other ways to make sure that we're creating feeders into the talent pool and identify people and inspire people, because one of the things that millennials and human beings, in my thinking, are motivated by what we do. I mean, we take care of our fellow human beings. So if that can't be motivating, if we can't wrap that in talent development mechanisms, shame on us as leaders. So
I guess the only other thing that I'll add is I think that it's a two-way street. So I think that up-and-comers teach me as much as hopefully I'm teaching them, because they're the new eyes and ears and windows to where we need to go for the future. So even though you might have not been in the industry a long time, I think you definitely should be involved in plotting out that next phase of strategy. Because you're going to be the consumers of the future, right? And understanding where we need to go with it. And the other thing is, I think to Ed's point, is never forget who you're serving in this whole industry, right? Because if you fail the patient, then you've failed the mission. So I think that's always has to be the driver that's kept in front of all of us.
Great. Well, I wish we had another hour to continue the conversation, but unfortunately we don't. So join me in thanking the panel very much. Thanks so much. And that concludes our session. Thank you all very much for coming out.